So if we're going to really understand Paul, we need to sort of take apart the stereotypes of what many of us think of the Apostle Paul as. So for example, here is a early century Orthodox painting of the Apostle Paul. And if you were to look at this picture, you would immediately say, well, Paul was vertically challenged, follically challenged, a bit negative, brooding, and not that much fun to be around. But that is actually the opposite of who Paul really was. So let's take that image and push it aside. And I want us to think about three popular figures in the world today that are more like who Paul really was. Let's take a look at our first. Now, Paul was an outdoor survivor. He was a person who knew how to live off the land. Paul could eat the right berries and eat the right animals and put up shelters, and he knew how to swim and climb. Remember that Paul walked thousands and thousands of miles in his life. So the first person I want you to think about is Bear Grylls from Man vs. Wild. And Bear, by the way, is an incredible Christian. But Bear is more like what Paul was. The second person you might think about, and some of you are going to have a hard time with this one, so just bear with me. But Paul was super competitive. As in, he wanted to win every single time that he went out and started a new church. He believed that the Christian faith was not just an individual thing that you sort of waddled through, but Christianity was a team sport, and he was going to win the game. And so today, some of you might be watching a football game about an older dude who might be a quarterback of a team that really hasn't done very well until this year, and his name might be Tom Brady. Now, I know half of the group today just put down thumbs down signs and half of you put heart signs, but whatever you think about Tom Brady, remember this old dude, like me, is super competitive, and he always tries to win the game almost at whatever cost. Let's just leave that one aside. Third figure I want you to think about Paul. Paul had the incredible ability to take punishment, to take torture, to take things that came against him, to take beatings. Let me just show you this. This is a text, our main text for the morning, 2 Corinthians. Listen for God's word. 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 27. This is what Paul describes as his life. I have worked very hard, been in prison, been severely flogged, been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times beaten with rods, once pelted with stones. 3 times shipwrecked, spent a night and a day on the open sea, been in danger from rivers, from bandits, gone without sleep. I have known hunger, says Paul, and thirst, and I have gone without food, and I have been cold, and I have been naked. Now, if any one of those things applied to our lives, we probably would say Christianity isn't for us, but not for Paul. And so when we think about a revolutionary who took a lot of punishment, let's think about a guy in the news right now, Alexei Navalny, who, remember, was nearly killed several times by the former KGB standing up against Putin. Now, I've prayed about this a lot, and I've studied Paul for most of my career, my ministry, 20 years now. I probably taught around 50 Bible studies on the epistles of Paul. And if I was to identify one thing that characterizes his resiliency, it would be his profession. Paul was a tent maker. You see, Paul, when he wasn't preaching and teaching and getting beaten, he was building tents. Now, we don't have the time today to talk about the beauty involved in stitching tents that were like sails on a great 4-masted bark ship. We don't have time to talk about the significance of tent building in the first century, which half of the population of the Middle East lived in tents. But let me just give you a bit, because this leads to resiliency. Now, I know this church is very active. You have a lot of backpackers. We have fishermen. We have outdoors people, and you know that today there are pop-up tents, dome tents, hoop tents, tunnel tents, geodesic tents. I got one of those. I love it. But the tent that Paul built was known as a cabin tent today, or a mainframe tent, or an A-frame tent. Here's an example from the Saudi royal family, which has an ancient culture. As you can see, the pillars are wrapped in silk. You can see that there are posts and there is fabric around the outside. Now here's a modern example. Trek Tents puts this together. Trek Tents, if you are watching. I think we deserve a little bit of a promotional push right there. And here's another one that you could find in especially the South. These are what is known as A-frame tents. These are the kinds of tents that Paul would build. Now, as Paul is building these tents, I believe he develops the recipe for resiliency. And that comes from his basic understanding of what it is to be a Christian. Christians have things that happen, hardships, travails. And yet Christians are people who are supported from underneath. In fact, the word that Paul uses more than any other word in the New Testament, more than any other word, more than love, more than grace, more than peace, is this word I want to teach you right now. It is hupomeno. Would you say that with me? Hupomeno. And hupo is, if you're a doctor or a nurse, you know that means hypo, to go under, a hypodermic needle. And meno is related to the word remain, which we still use today. It means to come underneath. So hupomeno are the poles or the stakes or the pegs underneath the tents of our lives.